Hello friends, today we will discuss about decarbonizing the transportation sector. So basically the whole story, as you know, when we talk about sustainable transportation system, so the shift is going towards instead of fossil fuel based or carbon economy based development, we are going towards renewable energy based development. So the trajectory is towards like decarbonization of everything, whatever anthropogenic activities are there, which are based on these energy intensive fossil fuel based activities. We are going towards, even if it is energy intensive, we are going to have the sources of energy which are less polluting and less emitting in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So when we talk about carbonization or decarbonization, so the basic issue is that the CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. When we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, basically we are talking about not only the CO2 emissions, but other emissions which are having the greenhouse effect or global warming effect or the effects which are causing climate change all over the globe, right. So we will discuss in today's lecture like what is the carbonization, especially in transportation sector we are focusing our all lectures, as you know. So without touching more on general nature aspects of carbonization or decarbonization, we will discuss about like carbonization of transport sector and the factors which are affecting the GHG emissions or greenhouse gas emissions in the transport sector. So how can we reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, that is how can we do decarbonization. Decarbonization means reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Okay. So we will discuss that what is the decarbonization in definition, and then what are the mitigation measures for achieving decarbonization. So reducing greenhouse gas emissions different ways, right. Then the potential barriers and opportunities of mitigation measures. So there may be different mitigation measures. So there will be some challenges and some opportunities. Okay. And then the policy framework for decarbonization transport sector, different kind of policies are there, different kind of practices are there. So we will discuss about them like passenger transport decarbonization options or avoid shift improve ASI related framework. Then there are recommendations from European Academic Science Advisory Council. So the recommendation based actions are there for by policy makers for the decision makers. So those kind of recommendations we will discuss. Then we will also discuss like decarbonization efforts in the Indian transportation sector. So especially focused on Indian transportation sector, we will have these discussions on like priority action areas and their scalability and applicability, then rail based scenarios or road based scenarios which are better and why they are better, then nationally determined contributions NDC targets which are established by India and which are to be achieved before or up to 2030. So those targets we will discuss and later we will conclude the lecture. So when we focus on carbonization or what is the carbonize, how do we carbonize, basically that is like converting something into carbon related products, carbon dioxide, carbon emissions, carbonic residues, okay, all those organic related things. So direct greenhouse gas emissions are basically the example of carbonization. So you can see in this figure like if you compare from 2010 to 1970. So in comparison to 1970, if we see the data of 2010, the CO2 equivalent emissions of the greenhouse gas emissions. So from 2.8 gigaton CO2 equivalent, because the greenhouse gases are not only the CO2 emissions, but other emissions of different gases which are having the similar effect like methane also, and it has been like 7 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions in 2010. So how much? 250% increase by this particular transport mode, only transport mode, you can see this much. So the biggest culprit in that sense is this road transport, you can see, in comparison to like rail and then pipeline or other kind of transportation modes may be there, but the road transportation is the biggest contributor in carbonization. So, this is the focused area basically we will see. Now, if we want to compare like major contributors for of transport emissions among G20 countries, okay, group of 20 countries. So, between 1990 to 2015, if we compare the data, so this is the graph which is showing like the size of these bubbles are basically the total emissions. So, you can say like United States, China, and then this Mexico, all these are big contributors. Even India is rapidly going towards joining this club of major contributors, right. But also we can see like percentage changes from 1990 to 2015. So, how much increase if we compare with this line which is the baseline of 1990. So, the biggest change is in China. Okay. So, that means more and more activities of the transport related infrastructure, transport related activities have been very intensive in those in that particular area, and India is also increasing in that sense, although in developed countries the increment is little lower, but already they are emitting lot of emissions of greenhouse gas emissions from the transport sector. Now, if we see the factors which are responsible for the GHG emissions from the transportation sector, then there are several factors like activity, for example, total passengers kilometer per year, or freight ton, means the total volume and the weight of the freight which has been transported per kilometer per year. So, those kind of activities they give the positive feedback loop you can see in this economic sector, because they are the drivers of the economy. Then the infrastructure and model choice, if we are having more on road transportation, our whole transport related activities are more dominated by road transportation, then as you have seen the transport emissions from the road sector is much more than other sectors. Energy intensity, like what kind of engine design is there, and efficiency or driver behavior, all those influence this energy intensity. Then fuel carbon intensity, for example, different kind of transport fuels give different kind of emissions, and their like per kilometer driven by certain fuel may be a different value of the greenhouse gas emissions or even air pollutants. So, like electricity or hydrogen fuel cell or gasoline or diesel, all they have different emission rates or emission volumes. Well, so you can see like these factors affecting greenhouse gas emissions. So, these categories have been explained properly here, and depending like the fuel category, the intensity of diesel, gasoline, they will be different. Okay. So, these kind of examples are there. Well, when we compare the capital cost and direct CO2 emissions, direct CO2 emissions, not only the indirect one, but the direct one, and the capacities for this bus rapid transit system and light rail or metro urban mass transit options, then you can see if we see this direct CO2 emissions, if we for a moment if we forget other factors, if we focus only on the CO2 equivalent emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions. So, the bus rapid transit is responsible for highest emissions 14 to 22 these gram CO2 per passenger per kilometer. So, that rate is quite high in comparison to like light rail, which is only 4 to 22, or metro this is 3 to 21. So, they are more or less same, but this bus rapid transit is more. So, that way road transportation sector is responsible more emissions of for more emissions of greenhouse gases in comparison to the rail transportation sector. Well, so when we focus upon decarbonization, so that means reduction of the carbon emissions, reduction of the CO2 emissions basically. Okay. So, that refers to the reducing the carbon dioxide emissions. Okay. Then when we see about like what is the ultimate goal. So, ultimate goal in context of Paris agreement of 2015, they want to reduce the levels of greenhouse gas emissions in comparison to this those pre-industrial levels. So, around 2 degree to 1.5 degree Celsius temperature should be reduced in that comparison. So, that is the goal basically, and we want to achieve that goal by reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases. So, different pathways have been suggested to achieve this Paris agreement and scenarios may be like how much emission reduction should be there for achieving 2 degree Celsius reduction or 1.5 degree Celsius reduction. So, you can see like 2015 this is the base emissions ton CO2 per capita, okay, and this BOU means this business as usual. So, if we go without changing any technology, without having any intervention to reduce the emissions, then it will increase like this. But if we adopt this policy of reducing up to 2 degree Celsius, then we will come here, reduction will be there, major reduction will be there of course for 1.5 degree Celsius reduction. So, these are the different pathways, you can see the historic emissions are there, this is going on like that. So, this business as usual scenario will go in that way increase, but this 2 degree Celsius and 1.5 degree Celsius reduction scenario will reduce the emissions of CO2. Well, when we talk about like what are the ways, what are the means, what are the policies and programs to reduce these carbon dioxide emissions or greenhouse gas emissions or to achieve the decarbonization, then in overall sense or in totality 4 pillars are very much discussed, which are like decarbonization of electricity generation, because as you know we use lot of coal based thermal power plants for energy production. So, that is responsible for lot of emissions of the CO2. So, if we go for like decarbonization of these plants, maybe like renewable nuclear which are emitting like they are neutral in the sense they are not emitting much CO2 except when we are building those plants, then of course we are using those raw material etcetera which are extracted and emissions are there, but later on very only operational related activities are there, very less amount of emission is there in comparison to the thermal power plants. Then the fuel shifting in transportation sector, okay. So, like for heating or for industrial emissions also, if we shift towards like electricity generated from renewable sources rather than fossil fuel based systems, the shift can be very much important for achieving decarbonization. Similarly, like this in buildings or in transport efficiency matters, okay, in all sectors. So, like even domestic areas in buildings, if we are having these light bulbs, if we are going for like efficient technologies like LED rather than the normal bulbs etcetera. So, that way we can achieve good efficiency in all sectors including building, transport and agriculture. Then we can also go for like eco-centric development and preservation of these natural carbon sinks like forest areas, agricultural practices without using much more these fossil fuels, rather better practices which are responsible for very less amount of emissions of greenhouse gases. So, rather increasing greenery and increasing the sink, because plants absorb the CO2, they are acting like the sink. So, if we go for these kind of natural habitats, we are increasing the sink for carbon dioxide. So, that is also helping because it is reducing the CO2 content in the atmosphere, right. Then if we talk about like transportation sector, decarbonization of the transportation sector, then we focus on infrastructure of the transportation sector, conveyance and equipments and the management and operations. All these 3 important activities are there which include economic, infrastructure, regulatory and innovation. So, in different color scheme you can see these different activities are there, like for infrastructure you can focus on parking or sharing rides or having some tracks for cycle, by walking, those kind of things, right. And if you go for innovations or IT, then electric vehicles or intelligent transportation systems, something like that. Regulatory areas like parking regulations may be there, you can charge some fee so that you can discourage people to bring their privately owned vehicles, rather they can shift towards public transportation system. So, to achieve the decarbonization, basically when we go for mobility transition or energy transition in transport. So, in mobility, without sacrificing the mobility related needs, we can go for sustainable mobility like reducing energy consumption. So, more public transportation system, more non motorized system, those kind of thing. Okay. Similarly, the clean energy. So, whatever energy which are we are using in the transportation sector, if we are deriving it from cleaner sources like renewable ones, then we are really going to achieve the decarbonization in that way. Well, when we talk about mitigation measures for achieving decarbonization, then there are certain ways like we can go for light duty vehicles which are of hybrid nature, okay, IC plus electric motor, battery operated vehicle. Okay, we have seen in other presentations also. So, that can really help us to reduce up to 35% compared to the non hybridized vehicles. So, that is a good achievement if we go for hybrid vehicles. Then heavy duty vehicles can be of efficient diesel engines. So, that can go for a 45% thermal efficiency to achieve basically. And then rail, waterborne craft or aircrafts, okay, those kind of transportation modes can really help us to reduce significantly the GHG emissions. We have seen in other presentations also like inland waterways and rail transportation sector, they have this like per ton per kilometer or per passenger per kilometer emission is very less in compared to the road transportation. Well, then we can also talk about like advanced propulsion systems. So, battery, fuel cell, electric drives for road transportation and the diesel hybrid rather than purely diesel locomotives for driving the trains, right. And then the waterborne crafts or inland waterways, you can say fuel carbon intensity reduction through like using the alternate fuels such as this LNG, that is liquid natural gas, and the CNG, compressed natural gas, electricity, hydrogen and biofuels, all those things. So, that way if you compare 2010 to 2030, so those policies can really help us to reduce this energy use per vehicle percentage reduction can be seen properly here. Well, behavioral aspects are also very important. So, like purchase behavior, if we go for cheaper vehicles, then their technology may not be very good. Okay. So, they are not very eco friendly. So, if we can invest little bit more, but that is eco friendly, then in longer term that the benefit, health benefit we have, because the emissions of the pollution and greenhouse gases are less. So, the benefits are quite several fold, although those are indirect effects and we do not visualize them very quickly. That is why our tendency is to go for cheaper things, but if we go for the eco friendly things which have invested in better technology, then little bit more costly, but it is better for overall quality of life. Then the new technologies and fuels are there. So, sometimes people have some inertia, they have some doubts, we do not know what kind of whether it is reliable or not, those kind of doubts are there. So, people wait, okay, other people will buy, only then I will also buy that battery operated vehicle, some those kind of tendencies there. Okay. Then on road fuel economy, so the consumption due to congestion is more. Okay. When speed is slow, the congestion is more, then consumption of fuel is more, as we have discussed it several times. So, the poor road should not be there, the quality of road should be very good. So, that smooth flow of the traffic must be achieved. Then eco driving, like fuel efficient driving behavior. So, the driving behavior also play important role in emissions, the total emissions. Then the hesitation using the new types of vehicles, okay, every time this happens. So, slowly people change the behavior. Then the driving rebound effects like easy and cheap travel also encourage more travel. Okay. So, if more travel, then again for example, road network if you are increasing, so more cars are there, then again emissions increase. In Delhi this has happened in a way, like even if CNG was implemented later on, after some dip again emissions increased because the sheer number of vehicles increased, right. Then vehicles choice related rebounds like over or high capacity vehicles in case of cheaper fuel. So, those indirectly they can really contribute to the emissions. Then company behavior like unnecessary freight movements, may be there. So, if logistic related planning is not better, then again emissions may be more. Well, there are then several barriers and opportunities of mitigation measures. So, they are discussed in these tables, and you can see in detail related to like battery operated vehicles, what are the barriers, like if charging infrastructure is not there, then again people hesitate to buy. So, if infrastructure is created, then people will be having more motivation to buy those kind of vehicles. So, opportunities are there, decarbonized electricity, then subsidies may be there. Only I think recently there are many advertisements from different state governments. They are promoting these electric vehicles. So, they are not charging road tax or registration tax, they are giving even subsidies for 2-wheelers like 20,000, for 4-wheelers 1.5 lakhs. So, those kind of promotional policies are there. So, opportunities are there for this sector, lot of opportunities are there. So, we have discussed these kind of barriers and opportunities in comparison to like energy intensity or efficiency technologies. So, these are tabulated in this, you can go through in detail. I will just skip them because this is all those kind of things which we have discussed several times. Then there are like policy frameworks for decarbonization of the transport. So, you see like spatial planning, IT based communications or car sharing, all those things we have already discussed. So, these are the policy framework we should focus upon. Then if we talk about like passenger transport decarbonization options, so like safe cycle lanes, again we have discussed this several times when we were focusing on non motorized kind of things. So, the cycle lanes, pedestrian zones, walkways, all those help people to decarbonizing, because they are not using these 2-wheelers or 4-wheelers, then emissions are automatically less. So, similarly like banning cars from the city centers, again we have seen these examples like London, that is congestion tax, city center kind of policies are there. So, you can see these low price public transport trains, we have discussed this again and again. So, I will not like to give more time on those things. Charges for parking and vehicles access to city center, congestion charges, we have discussed all those things. So, these are the repetition, but because these are the important part of decarbonization, that is why they have been included in this particular thing. Now, if we compare like conversion efficiency of electricity used in battery of electric vehicles or these fuel cell vehicles or synthetic fuel ICs, internal combustion engines. So, you can see like overall conversion of the power transmission is 69% maximum in battery operated electric vehicles, whereas in fuel cell it is only 26%, and in internal combustion IC engines it is only 13%. So, it makes lot of sense if we go for electric battery operated electric vehicles. So, we are this transmission power efficiency we are achieving very high. So, that means with the same energy we will have the the mobility much more than in comparison to other transportation modes. Well, when we couple this transportation electricity in buildings and industry sector, then lot of decarbonization related things can be really achieved. So, when we like solar pans using in the buildings as well as renewable sources. So, whether you are using in buildings, lighting etc., or in the transportation sector, that really helps in decarbonization. So, comparison is very you can see very visible, like range of the life cycle CO2 emissions for different vehicles and the fuel type. When you see this petrol and the diesel, so this much is their values are like average for a particular this total 220,000 kilometer travel or life cycle, you can see. So, the diesel and petrol, they are having around 250 CO2 emissions gram per kilometer when we talk about life cycle. Renewable electricity is very less, around between 50 to 100. So, again this is also like visualization of benefits of in terms of decarbonization. Then we talk about like avoid, shift, improve framework. So, avoiding like those kind of logistics which are more of nature motorized, shifting towards walking, non motorized ways, and improving mobility of electric based kind of things. So, these are the ways we can do recommendations based on the recommendations by European Academic Science Advisory Councils. So, they have given these kind of suggestions which can be easily implemented in transportation sector. Okay. So, that way we can improve the efficiency of transportation. Then how to access obstacles to low carbon solutions. So, these are again ways which can be implemented in behavioral assessment or resource assessment or policy designs. So, that can help again for decarbonization. Now, if we talk about the case study like Indian transportation sector, how do we going towards decarbonizing efforts? What are the efforts which we are making for decarbonizing the Indian transportation sector? So, you can see like passenger traffic share on road it is 89%, rail it is only 10%. You can see. So, the huge scope is there for decarbonizing the road transportation sector. Similarly, in freight traffic also only rail has 31%, road still has 62%. So, again huge scope is there. If we can shift freight from road to the rail or inland waterways etc., like these coastal shipping is there 7%, but huge scope is there in inland waterways, in the rivers etc. If we can have those kind of infrastructure, lot of scope is there for shifting this freight from the road to rail, as well as if we can have integrated approach, then we can go for inland waterways also. So, there is a huge scope for reduction of transport related emissions from the road sector. So, 1990 to 2015 comparison is given here. So, the total emissions like 294%, this has grown since 1990. So, this kind of path is there. If we can reduce that path of carbonization towards decarbonization, so benefits are much more. If we talk about like priority actions which are related to decarbonizing the transportation sector in India, so the highway must be of good nature, urban planning should be of good nature, then high quality railway infrastructure can be there for services, and we are having collaborations with Japanese technology and other mass transit related public transportation system, metros etc. are there. So, we can see the examples for renewable energy options in transportation sector. So, conventional drives, internal combustion engines to alternative drives, okay, electricity vehicles etc. So, this representation is there. How can we go for transformation from IC engine to battery operated vehicles. Then if we talk about action plans up to 2050, so the rail based and road based scenarios you can see. So, there are certain indicators which can be used for shifting towards that road based or railway based. So, you can see like sustainable and urban planning to counteract urban sprawl. So, these kind of values are there which can be seen. So, in urban planning which are long and complicated, like in Copenhagen this implemented for 70 years ago. So, it is a very long kind of planning, but we have to do consistent efforts are to be made and we have to be patient to achieve those goals. And then if we talk about like railways etc., so again which kind of mobility or modes we are giving emphasis, that can be seen from best practices around the world, and how can we achieve those reductions in GHG emissions. Like rail focused scenario you can see innovative urban planning 205 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, and modal shift 550, improved efficiency 65, whereas road focused this is values 205, 40 and 570 electrification. So, lot of advantage is there, lot of scope is there for reduction in road transportation. So, that we have seen in other values also. Now, nationally determined contributions target by India. So, these are the targets like 30% electric car sales by 2030 should be achieved, 100% battery electric vehicle sales for urban buses by 2030. So, lot of efforts are being made at the national level, and all states are also coming with new policies, new measures, new programs which can help the people shift towards less polluting vehicles or these kind of renewably energy charged kind of infrastructure and mobility. So, these are the implementation status which can be seen in these tables, and ultimately we can see that this transportation sector accounts for around 1/4 of the total global energy related greenhouse gas emissions. So, huge scope is there. If you see this 2019 data, and the increasing energy demand and the growing number of vehicles on roads are the main obstacles. So, we can go for better policies which can promote the public transportation system, non motorized. So, urban planning has to be that way, like people feel to walk, whatever activities they want to do, they do not need any kind of vehicles in that way. So, those kind of planning measures are to be there. So, decarbonization effort is basically an integrated way approach should be adopted, so that we can achieve decarbonization in all sectors including the transportation sector. So, accordingly policy and programs have to be adopted by each country. So, this is all for today, and these are the references which you can go through for additional information. So, thank you for your kind attention. See you again. Thanks a lot.